still matriculating into the room, but I'm going to go ahead and do a welcome and be respectful of everyone's time. Good morning, everyone. My name is Corey Atkins. I'm the Vice President and General Counsel of the Asheville Area Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to welcome you all to our next in a series of town halls. This one will be focusing specifically on the issue of vaccine requirements in the workplace. So thank you all for joining us here today. We are honored and grateful to be joined by two volunteers who've given us their time here today and are experts in this area. First off, we have Sabrina Rockoff, who's managing partner with McGuire Wood Bissett here in Asheville. Thank you for being here, Sabrina. And we also have Amparo Acosta, who is a public health nurse supervisor for Buncombe County. So Amparo, thank you for being here as well to answer health-related questions with the county. Let me be very clear about this up front. And then give you all a disclosure, this conversation and this dialogue that we're going to have today is not a political discussion in any way whatsoever, nor is it dealing with government mandates of any kind. What it will focus on is the issue of what you can or can't do as an employer in Buncombe County and Asheville, North Carolina, and across the state and country, and what you can do in regards to your employers, your employees, and their ability to and your ability to enforce vaccine requirements at your place of business or not. And so that's where the questions are going to be focused. That's where the conversation is going to be focused. Now, due to the high volume of interest and the number of you who are here to join us today, we did send out an email yesterday asking for your questions to be sent in advance. Ms. Rockoff will give a full presentation on the issue with the most common questions that we hear in this arena, but we have taken those questions in, and I'm going to get through them to the best of my ability. We got an overwhelming response to those, and so I will do my best to get to as many of those and address as many different concerns that you all have out there in the public and in the business community here in Western North Carolina. And so that will be the run of show of things. Ms. Rockoff will give her presentation first, and then I will start moderating based on the questions that you all sent ahead of time. There will not be a live chat function on this webinar and this town hall. So we apologize for that, but we're doing our best to be respectful of time and make sure that we're addressing all the issues related to vaccine requirements in the workplace. With the recent FDA full approval of the Pfizer vaccine, this is a very prescient conversation that we're having. And quite frankly, this has been one of the most common questions we have gotten here at the Asheville Chamber from our business leaders and our business owners over the last month or two. And so we hope to get through all this and address your concerns adequately. With that, please join me in welcoming Sabrina Rockoff with McGuire Wood Bissett to kick us off. Sabrina, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Corey. And I'm going to share my screen here. And you tell me if you can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
All right. So I've called this COVID vaccines, what you should know. And what I've tried to do is, based on your questions that you put in, as well as questions I'm getting from clients, come up with the most common questions and answer those. One caveat to my answers, the EEOC has given us some guidance, OSHA has given us some guidance. There are a lot of legal experts who have given their opinion on these issues, but as we've been for the last 18 months, we're in an untested and uncharted situation. So this is what we think based on what we know now, but it's all subject to change because even where we do have laws, they've not really been tested in the courts yet. There's just not been time for that. So here's what we know now. And I've done this in a question and answer format. Can I ask if my employees have been vaccinated? Yes, as a private employer, you can do that if they are coming into the office. The question of whether an employee is vaccinated or not may not even be considered medical information under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's actually some conflicting guidance about that. But even if it is considered medical information under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA allows you to ask questions that are job related and consistent with business necessity, and asking if an employee who is coming into your workplace is vaccinated would likely meet that requirement. So yes, a lot of people throw around HIPAA I've seen that when we're talking about this question. HIPAA really doesn't apply to this question. This is really an ADA question. You can also ask for voluntary identification, of course, at any time. You can ask your employees to voluntarily identify if they're vaccinated, and then just assume that the ones who do not voluntarily identify may not be, if you're trying to get a sense of where your workforce falls. Can I ask my employees for proof of vaccination? The answer here again is yes. I think it is less risky, again, if they are coming into the office. I think there's a few different ways you can do this. You can just ask them yes or no. You can ask them to affirm that they are with dates of their vaccines if you don't want to actually get a copy of the vaccination card, or you can request to see the card, or you can request to copy the card. If you copy the card, make sure you're putting it in the medical file, the employee's medical information file, as opposed to their personnel file. Again, unclear if you have to do that, but there's no harm in doing that. And I think that's a less risky thing to do. Can I incentivize my employees to get vaccinated? I get this question a lot. The answer is yes, but, which is always the lawyer's answer, right? Yes, no, maybe, but there's always a but. Yes, but if you have employees who meet an exemption or need an exemption under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or they need a religious accommodation under Title VII. And we're going to talk for a minute more in depth about what those things mean when we talk about requiring vaccines. But if you have someone, even if you're just incentivizing, if you have someone who really cannot get vaccinated, then I think it's best to offer them some way to earn the same incentive. And the importance of doing that increases with the value of the incentive. If it's a very small incentive, it's probably not as risky to not do that, but the greater the incentive, I think the riskier it is not to do that. So some people think they're just going to incentivize vaccines and not have to get into this issue of whether people qualify for exemptions or not. I don't think it's quite that easy. Another thing to think through, if you pay monetary incentives as part of getting people to get vaccinated, you do need to put that on folks' paycheck, and it needs to go through the payroll process because that's really a bonus. And so it needs to be paid and taxed as a bonus. And you need to be very careful that monetary incentives may also qualify as non-discretionary bonuses under the wage and hour regulations, which means if you have someone who works overtime in the period that they earn the bonus, you likely need to calculate that bonus into their pay when you figure out what their overtime rate would be. So I like PTO as an incentive because you get around a lot of these issues, tax issues and wage and hour issues. If you want to give folks PTO or something else like that, that isn't cash, but some people are offering cash. Just make sure you do it right. Can I require my employees to be vaccinated? This is sort of the $1 million question that I've been getting a lot. Here, I think yes, if they are coming into the workplace. I think it is, again, more difficult to mandate it for people who are not coming into the workplace because it's harder to explain how that's related to your business. If you mandate it, you do need to consider allowing accommodations, reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities or religious reasons that they cannot be vaccinated. And we'll talk about both of those things more in a minute. We're also going to talk about the workers' compensation and OSHA implications of requiring the vaccine. And one thing that I do want to be clear about with what I'm telling you now is our best guidance right now under the law is what has happened with mandatory flu vaccine requirements. So, there's not a lot out there about mandatory COVID vaccine requirements yet and how the law is going to look at that because they're just now happening. But we have had some employers that have had mandatory flu vaccine requirements for some time. And so there is some established law around mandatory vaccination requirements by employers and how all these different laws interact with those requirements. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So the first thing you need to think about if you're requiring your employees to be vaccinated is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires employers to make a reasonable accommodation for an employee's own health condition that prevents them from being able to perform parts of their job, but would allow them, if given, to perform the essential functions of their job. Okay. So if you require vaccines for people who are coming into the office and you have an employee who says, I can't be vaccinated because I have a certain condition, or perhaps I had one shot and had a severe reaction and my doctor has advised I can't get the second vaccine. I've seen some of that. Then you need to get information from the employee, from their doctor, that is sufficient to explain why they cannot be vaccinated. Now, the law is clear. The EEOC has provided guidance that says you can deny an employee access to the workplace if their failure to get vaccinated is a direct threat, even if they qualify for a reasonable accommodation. So the first question is, does the employee have to be in the workplace to do their job, right? If you have an employee who presents you with sufficient documentation from their doctor to explain that they cannot be vaccinated and you have a vaccine requirement, can they work from home? If the answer is they can perform the essential functions of their job from home, then the best thing to do, the least risky thing to do, would be to allow that to happen. However, if they have to be in the workplace to be able to perform their job, then you need to do a direct threat analysis. And the EEOC has provided us with the factors that you need to consider in doing a direct threat analysis. You need to think about the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm related to the risk, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. And of course, here, the potential harm would be the employee contracting COVID or the employee contracting COVID and spreading that to other employees or to the public. So the EEOC acknowledges that as more people are vaccinated, the direct threat calculus may change. So for example, if your workforce is all vaccinated, but one person, the threat that person poses to the workforce is very different than if, less than 50% of your workforce is vaccinated. And the threat to that person is different than, if if the rest of your workforce is vaccinated versus 50% or less. So this is going to be a case by cases determination as to what you can do. The EEOC also advises that you consider the employee's contact with vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, including prolonged contact with individuals whose vaccination status you may not know. So someone who's sitting in a cubicle all day poses a very different risk than someone who is out interacting with members of the public who may or may not be vaccinated. If you have an employee who cannot be vaccinated, and let's say they're in a position that has a lot of public contact, but you have a position that doesn't have a lot of public contact, that's open, that they are qualified for, it also may be an accommodation to move that person into that open position, or perhaps you even have an open position where the duties can be done from home. It may also be an accommodation to move that individual into that open position. If you move the individual into an open position as an accommodation, you pay them whatever that new position would have otherwise paid. If you cannot accommodate them, you have an employee who cannot be vaccinated, they have to be in the workplace, you feel like there is a direct threat and there's no other position they can do, then you can terminate their employment. But I would advise before you do that, that you seek legal counsel and really discuss how you've evaluated that direct threat before you make that decision. So that's the disability exemption. There's also a religious exemption. The religious exemption requires less of the employer to decide whether or not you need to grant it, but it's also a little murkier on what the employer can require. It's also, frankly, a little bit murkier on what qualifies as a religious exemption. If you are already aware as an employer that an employee is of a religion that has as one of its tenets that there is not a belief in vaccines, and you're already aware of that, then if you put up a mandatory vaccine requirement, you can't require that employee to now bring you in documentation. However, if you're not aware or you have reason to doubt the religious belief, you can ask the employee to provide documentation of their need for a religious exemption. There are court rulings that have said in the past that just being anti-vaccine or being against one vaccine is not in and of itself a religion. So just being against the vaccine does not necessarily qualify somebody for a religious exemption. It has to be a tenet of an otherwise recognized religion. If an employee does need an accommodation due to a religious belief, then the employer must grant that accommodation unless it would present an undue hardship to the employer, which courts have said is more than a de minimis cost to the employer. And it says that employees may be excluded from the workplace if failure to be vaccinated would present an undue hardship. Again, we don't have a lot of case law here or guidance beyond what I've just told you on how to navigate these situations. Certainly, again, if you have an employee who is able to perform their job at home and they need a religious exemption, a bona fide religious exemption, then certainly allowing them to perform the essential functions of their job from home is going to be the least risky decision to make. Also, same thing, if you can move them into a position, that's going to be least risky. But if they have to come into the workplace to do their job, particularly given the difference that the CDC has provided in having to quarantine and the disruption to your workplace, if an employee is vaccinated versus not vaccinated and exposed, I think you at least have some good grounds to say that it presents an undue hardship to the employer if by just allowing employees not to be vaccinated if you're otherwise requiring it in the workplace. So another question I've gotten is, what if I require the vaccine and an employee has an adverse reaction to it? And this is where, again, we are relying primarily on what has happened with the flu vaccine, because that's the closest thing we've got right now to know what to do. If you require a vaccine and there is an adverse reaction, it may very well be a workers' compensation injury. Even if you are only incentivizing it, there are some people who think it could be a workers' compensation injury. I think that is less likely, but we don't know is the answer. But if it is required for the flu vaccine, a lot of times it has been a compensable workers' compensation injury if people have adverse reactions. So that would lead us to believe it would be the same for the COVID vaccine. I would point out, however, that if you have a COVID cluster, that also may be covered by workers' compensation. So you're sort of in a position as an employer that either way, I think you may have some workers' compensation risk. Now, the good news for you for both of those things is that if it is potentially a compensable injury under workers' comp, that prevents you as an employer from being sued in court for any damages. Because in North Carolina, we have what's called the workers' compensation bar. So if it is a compensable injury under workers' comp, the employee is barred from bringing any other type of claim related to that injury against the employer in civil court. So as an employer, I would say in both of these instances, it's actually a good thing if it's covered by workers' compensation. If you require it, it also could be a reportable or a recordable injury under OSHA. Now, it would need to, the adverse action or reaction would need to otherwise meet the requirements for an OSHA reportable or recordable injury. But for the flu vaccine, an adverse reaction could be, depending on how severe, a reportable or recordable injury. And so we would presume that would be the same thing for COVID vaccines. COVID clusters in your workplace also could meet this threshold. So again, either way, whether you're requiring the vaccine or you have COVID in your workplace, you could end up with an OSHA reportable or recordable incident depending on the severity. And I'm not getting more into the details because it does break out by industry. And so that could get really complicated in trying to explain in the time we have what's a recordable or a reportable injury. So if you have questions about that for your industry, certainly consult with your legal counsel. Do I need to warn my employees of risk prior to vaccination? The answer to that is no. That's the job of the person administering the vaccine. So, if you are just requiring it and you are not yourself administering it, the answer to that is no. And I don't think it really provides you with any added protection. Just like warning employees of the risk of COVID, I don't think likely provides you with any additional legal protection right now either. Can I provide my employees with the opportunity to be vaccinated? And what I mean by that is, can I set up a clinic and have, like a flu shot clinic? We do that at our firm every year, right? And so can I have a clinic like that? The answer is yes, but keep a few things in mind. It is risky, I believe, to require your employees to get the vaccine from someone with whom you contract. So, if you say, hey, we're requiring the vaccine, or even if you say, hey, we're just incentivizing it, or we're encouraging you to get it, and here's a way for you to get it, but you can go get it somewhere else, I think that's fine. But if you start requiring your employees to get it from your vendor, I do think that is riskier. The EEOC also points out that there are some questions anyone has to answer before they're going to be vaccinated about their health. And if you as the employer are requiring your employees to use your vendor, then it could be that you will be seen as administering that medical exam, and that could create a problem under the ADA. So the EEOC guidance provides that offering employees the option to voluntarily be vaccinated by your clinic is fine, as long as you give them the option to be vaccinated elsewhere. So that's how I would recommend you do it if you decide to go that route. Can I require testing or vaccination? This has been another question I've gotten a lot. And the answer to that is yes, but if you have an individual who cannot be vaccinated due to religious reasons or disability under the ADA, then I think you likely need to pay for the employee's time getting tested and for the test. Now, if your answer is, I'm going to pay for that for everybody, then I don't think you need to get into the exemption question or the accommodation question. But if you are wanting to delineate and say, if an employee chooses not to be vaccinated, then that employee has to get tested on their own time and pay for their own test, I do think you have to get into the accommodation question. There's certainly less risk in requiring that for individuals who are just choosing not to be vaccinated, but I do think it's risky to do it for individuals who cannot be vaccinated. Should I get employees or customers to sign a waiver about COVID? My answer here is likely no. First, we've got the workers' comp issue, and employees cannot waive their right to workers' compensation. It cannot be done in North Carolina. So having them sign a waiver cannot prevent them from filing a workers' comp claim if they get COVID. There's also a North Carolina statute that provides immunity in most circumstances if you're following protocols, and that's even if a customer claims they got COVID from you. They would have to show that you were grossly negligent or engaged in intentional wrongdoing in order to bring a civil action against you in court. So, I think in most instances, it's going to be really hard to enforce, and it's going to be difficult on your employees getting customers to sign those waivers. And I don't think it's really going to do you a lot of good. So those are the questions that I prepared as part of my presentation. I hope I covered a lot of the most common questions, but I will now turn it over to Corey to ask some of the others that we got. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. I appreciate that. And that's really informative. I certainly learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. If you're concerned because as an employer, you want to make sure that you got the information correctly, I failed to mention up front, but we are recording this town hall. So it'll be online shortly after we're finished here today, and you can have access to all the slides and information Sabrina just shared, as well as the questions we're about to go through now. So with that said, let me bring in Amparo in this on the health side of things, and we'll kind of jump back and forth between you two from some of the questions that we got. And first of all, for Amparo, is there a deck that exists for employers that addresses the reasons people have for not being vaccinated yet? The North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services did a really good one to encourage vaccines when they first became available. Now that we're kind of past the stage of early adopters, middle adopters being vaccinated, we have an employer that would like help specifically to appeal to the late adopters and those who are still against it, maybe for a reason that we didn't address just now with ADA compliance rules or religious exemption. They just are against it generally. And I think this person is looking for some guidance on that issue, Amparo, if you have it. And thanks for being here again.
Hi, thank you for the invite. And hi to everybody that is on this very important, town hall meeting. I know that the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services and also the CDC, they have a lot of information about vaccines.